All right, well, good to see all of you. You'll notice a little bit of a different background. I think that most of you will probably remember at the start of the semester that I mentioned that I am also the director of the Texas Military Forces Museum, which is the official museum of the Texas National Guard. That museum is located at Camp Mabry, just off Mopac at 35th Street. It is a free museum that is open to the public, although right now it is closed due to the pandemic. But that means that we have a really big and cool story to tell, starting with the first militia muster in Stephen F. Austin's colony in 1823, going through the 19th century, and then of course the 20th and the 21st century. We don't tell the story of all Texans in the military, or all military things that ever happened in Texas. We focus on the volunteer and militia units of Texas in the 19th century and the role of the Texas Army and Air National Guard in the 20th and the 21st century. And that means that we talk about World War II both in Europe and the Pacific, and thus the background that I have here. This is part of our collection. That's an M4 Sherman tank behind me, and an M3 half-track right next to me. Both these vehicles are operational. We take them out from time to time to do living history programs and battle reenactments and that sort of thing. And you can always Google Texas Military Forces Museum and find out what we're up to. But I thought you might enjoy getting a look at some of this stuff, and it would be refreshing to have a different background than the blue curtain and the flag that you usually see behind me, and perhaps a little bit more enjoyable to have me at a little bit more of a distance from the camera than I usually am. So that is a brief explanation of where I am, why things look a little different than they usually do. This, of course, is going to be lecture number 14, the second half of chapter 26. So we looked last time out at where World War II comes from in a very broad, undetailed way, really, as we are forced to do as part of a survey class. Today we're going to look at America's participation in the Second World War, and again, this is going to be very broad brush strokes. You know, we could take the war and turn it into an entire semester. We could take, you know, the military campaigns, and almost each one of those could be its own lecture. We do not have time for that. What I'm trying to do here is to give you a general sense of the course of the war and the impact that the United States had on it. So when we left off last time, we have examined the conquest of the Nazis and the fascists in the European theater. And remember that by the time we get to December of 1941, the Germans have overrun Norway, they've overrun Denmark, they've overrun Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg. They have defeated and overrun France. They, along with the Italians, they have been busy in the Balkans, and so Yugoslavia, Greece, Albania have fallen. The Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Finns have all joined the war on the side of the Axis powers. Ethiopia has fallen to the Italians, and from Italy, Benito Mussolini had launched an invasion of Egypt, which was a British colony. This instigated the North Africa campaign, one of the more dramatic campaigns of World War II that would pit the British Eighth Army against what was known as the Africa Corps, which contained a couple of very good German divisions and a large Italian army, all of it under the command of a brilliant German leader by the name of Erwin Rommel, who would ultimately be made a field marshal for his conduct of the war in North Africa, which was really a very dramatic seesaw thing, back and forth. The Germans would beat the British and drive them back hundreds of miles, and then the British would recover and they would counterattack and they drive the Germans back hundreds of miles. But in early 1942, we're going to see that campaign swing very much in favor of the Germans, at least for a while. Rommel was such a such brilliant military commander that he outlasted several of his British counterparts who were fired one after another for their inability to cope with him, and that earned Rommel the nickname of the Desert Fox, Beyond these conquests, the Germans, of course, have invaded the Soviet Union. And they, in 1941, June of 1941, they launched a surprise attack on Stalin, disregarding their non-aggression pact with the communist country. Stalin and Hitler, of course, loathed one another. They knew that sooner or later they were going to fight. Stalin had just thought that it might take longer, that Germany would not deliberately begin a two-front war. Remember, it's still fighting England, which means it's fighting the British Empire. The German attempt to subdue England with an aerial assault, the Battle of Britain, had failed, and the Germans have been reduced to fighting the British in North Africa and waging a new battle at the Atlantic in an attempt to starve England into surrender. And the aerial campaign, of course, between Britain and Germany is ongoing, with each side periodically bombing the other's territory. And that meant that the Germans were kind of busy in Western Europe. They had to occupy everything that they had conquered, and the same thing was true down in the Balkans. So Stalin was really surprised when the Germans turned against him, when they turned against him. And when the Germans launched their massive offensive called Operation Barbarossa, it enjoyed enormous initial success. The Germans replicated their blitzkrieg tactics, and entire Soviet armies were destroyed by the German advance. Of course, casualties on both sides were absolutely horrific, but the Soviets managed to absorb the blow. They had unlimited manpower to throw into the battle. They had enormous amounts of space that they could surrender before the Germans really got to the vitals of the Soviet Union. The Russian people rallied around the communist dictatorship to fight for their motherland in what they called the Great Patriotic War. So everybody else calls it World War II. Russia calls it the Great Patriotic War. And indeed, the bulk of the German army will be tied down fighting the Russians throughout the conflict. And by a large margin, this will be the bloodiest theater of World War II as well, at least on the battlefield. The Russians picked up entire factories and moved them east to keep them out of the reach of the Germans. And the Germans came very, very, very close. They laid Leningrad under a siege that would last for more than 900 days. They got within sight of Moscow before the Russian winter hit, and it was one of the worst winters that anybody could remember in a very long time. The German army had been built for rapid campaigning. It was not equipped for a long slugging match kind of a war. It certainly was not equipped for the bitter winter weather, and so the German offensive stalled, and the Russians, who of course had rivalry with the Japanese in Asia, especially in Manchuria. Japan and Russia had fought a brief little war with each other in 1939 until they both decided to back away from that fight. The Russians were keeping large reserves of troops in Manchuria to guard against a Japanese attack, and we remember that the Japanese are allies now of Italy and Germany. They're one of the three Axis powers, and it's going to be reserves withdrawn from the Japanese front in Manchuria and rushed westward, who are going to help save Moscow from being captured in the winter of 1941. So that kind of brings us up to date in Europe. In Asia, the Japanese, of course, had overrun Manchuria and established a puppet government, the government of Manchukuo, in 1931. In 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of China. And this, of course, was something that the United States found appalling. We pushed back against it. FDR, of course, was becoming increasingly concerned about what was going on in Europe. He was equally concerned about what was going on in Asia, but he perceived Germany to be a much more dire threat. It was a bigger country, it was a richer country, it had more resources, it had a bigger army, and therefore strategically it was perceived to be more capable of doing harm to the United States than the Japanese were. Not the Japanese were to be taken lightly. The Japanese had a very good Navy. It was on par with the American Navy in 1939, 1940, 1941. And the goal of Roosevelt was to try and stymie Japanese aggression in Asia with economic sanctions. And so we took certain steps, and especially after the fall of Western Europe brought the Japanese to occupy French Indochina and other territory that had been lost by Allied powers that had been defeated by Hitler. The United States began to put economic constraints on the Chinese economy, first banning the export of metals and scrap metals and these sorts of things. But the one that really bit was an embargo on oil. The United States was then, like it is now, a oil exporter. Japan got most of its oil from America or from the Dutch East Indies and other allied countries. Basically what FDR was hoping here was that by strangling the Japanese of oil, he would throttle their military campaigns and maybe even get them to abandon their efforts in China. We took other steps. Remember that the Philippines, only 700 miles from the coast of Asia, from the coast of China, is a American colony. We also have the possessions of Wake and Guam and Midway out there in the Pacific, in addition to Hawaii and American Samoa, which is between the U.S. and Australia. Australia and New Zealand, remember, are part of the British Empire, and they have soldiers fighting in North Africa in the 8th Army against Rommel. And we moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet under the command of Admiral Kimmel from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That made the admirals a little bit nervous because it was sort of sticking it out there where the Japanese might be able to attack it. But Roosevelt was basically doing that as a deterrent. And we were also sending reinforcements to the American troops who were in the Philippines. And these troops, along with the Filipino Army, were under the command of World War I hero Douglas MacArthur. What the United States believed, or hoped at least initially, was all of this would forestall Japan from further aggression. And of course it didn't. That backfires rather badly. What it does is it convinces the Japanese that they have an option. They can either kneel down to American pressure, give up all their hopes of becoming a great power and finishing the conquest of China, or they could strike to capture the resources, the tin, the rubber, the manganese, the oil that they needed by conquering Burma, by driving into British India, by overrunning the Dutch East Indies, which were very wealthy in all these raw materials, maintaining their forward momentum in China. They knew that the United States would not stand idly by and watch that happen, and so America would have to be knocked back on its heels. It would have to be struck in such a way that it would take the United States a long time to recover. By the time the U.S. recovered, the Japanese would have completed their conquest and fortified them, and the thought of counterattacking to regain the lost territory, sustaining the casualties that would be necessary to roll back Japanese conquest would be something that the American government, the American people had no stomach for, and therefore they would let the Japanese have what they had taken. This is the thinking in Japanese minds. The United States was not ignorant of what the Japanese were doing, despite the fact that there were peace negotiations that were going on. the U.S. had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. Now, that doesn't mean that we can read it word for word, but it meant that we pretty much knew what the Japanese were doing. And so we knew that the Japanese had decided on war. And on November 27th of 1941, the War Department sent a warning to U.S. forces all throughout the Pacific that war with Japan could start at any time. So it's not that we didn't expect a war with the Japanese. We did expect a war with the Japanese, and we expected that war to start at the very end of November or sometime in December of 1941. But what we expected was that the Japanese would strike primarily at the American bases in the eastern Pacific. The Philippines was the logical first target. British Hong Kong was a logical first target. Guam and Wake were logical first targets. The Dutch East Indies were logical first targets. Where nobody expected the Japanese to strike was Hawaii. And that was because Pearl Harbor and Hawaii is a long way away from Japan, some 1,200 miles. The Japanese would have to sail through waters where they were apt to be detected. So, it's thousands of miles across the Pacific. But in that last 1,200, they would have to move through water that was very much under the gaze of American military forces, and nobody believed that the Japanese could do it. The American thinking was still geared toward a traditional naval war that revolved around the battleship, and American war plans envisioned that the Japanese would strike Guam, they would strike Wake, they would strike Hong Kong and Burma and the Dutch East Indies, and they would strike the Philippines. And what was supposed to happen is the American and Filipino forces under MacArthur were supposed to hold out, and the U.S. Navy would come sailing to their rescue. The Japanese Navy would sortie to meet the American fleet. There would be a giant battleship fight somewhere near the Philippines. Of course, the Americans anticipated winning it. We would be able to relieve the Philippines, and the war would be won. The Japanese short-circuited that by striking the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. They managed against all odds to achieve tactical surprise. There's a lot of reasons for that. There had been lots of false alarms at Pearl Harbor. There had been lots of drills. Everybody was sort of exhausted. And on a Sunday morning, we were not as prepared as we ought to be. The story of Pearl Harbor is its own fascinating saga. But for our purposes, the Japanese managed to achieve a surprise. They struck Pearl Harbor with two raids, aircraft raids, aircraft launched by Japanese aircraft carriers. So several hundred miles from Hawaii, the Japanese planes came in. They struck the American Pacific Fleet, which was sitting at anchor in Pearl Harbor. They also attacked the nearby airfields of the U.S. Army Air Corps. The second raid met significant resistance. The first raid managed to land its blows initially without much resistance at all, though American forces did respond fairly quickly. But by the time December 7, 1941 was over, the United States had suffered a devastating blow. 96 Army aircraft had been destroyed outright, and 92 naval aircraft had been lost. Another 160 American aircraft had been badly damaged. The U.S. Navy alone had 2,008 men killed and 710 wounded. Many of those dead were lost when the battleship USS Arizona blew up as a result of a Japanese bomb penetrating its deck armor and exploding in its forward ammunition magazine. The Marines lost 109 killed, 69 wounded. The Army, 218 dead, 364 wounded, and 68 Hawaiian civilians were killed, along with 35 others that were wounded. The United States battleship fleet was sunk. and some of those ships were lost completely. Several destroyers were sunk, and you had 3 of the battleships badly damaged, but were salvageable, and another 3 that were damaged but not sunk, couldn't be raised. Pearl Harbor was an unmitigated disaster on a whole number of levels. Nonetheless, it's important to note that Pearl Harbor was not the disaster that it might have been. The U.S. Aircraft carriers that were in the Pacific, the Lexington and the Enterprise, were not in Pearl Harbor that Sunday as the Japanese expected them to be. They had sailed into the Pacific to ferry aircraft to some of the American bases, and so they weren't sitting there like the battleships, which means that they escaped, and that turns out to be extremely important because one of the things Pearl Harbor did was to end the reign of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon. The aircraft carrier is now going to take that role, and so by sinking our battleships, the Japanese forced us to think like an aircraft carrier navy. That turns out to be a very good thing, and the fact that the Japanese did not catch our carriers in riding at anchor in Pearl Harbor made the Japanese admiral in charge of the Pearl Harbor strike, Admiral Nagumo, very nervous, and he decided against a third strike, and that was a vital thing because the lack of a third strike meant that the Japanese did not attack and destroy the submarine base at Pearl Harbor, nor the above-ground oil storage at Pearl Harbor. The United States, in fact, had more oil stored at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, than Japan had in its entire national reserve. And if those oil storage units had been destroyed, the fleet would have had to retreat back to San Francisco. So the Japanese failed to get that. They also failed to hit American submarines, and this turns out to be a really bad thing for the Japanese because the submarine was also going to become a dominant weapon in the Pacific in World War II, especially in the hands of the Americans. The Japanese tended to use their submarines against warships. The United States, however, is going to take a page from Germany and practice unrestricted submarine warfare against the Japanese. And so the irony here, of course, is that we were appalled by unrestricted submarine warfare in 1914, 1915, 1916, and it helped to get us involved in World War I in 1918. But by the time you get to 1941, everybody's come to realize that the only way that submarines can actually be useful is to attack without warning, to use stealth and surprise. The Germans are certainly doing this in the Atlantic, where they're using radio to coordinate the attacks of their U-boats. So instead of having just one U-boat go after an Allied convoy, the Germans will gather 3, 4, 5, maybe sometimes as many as 10 or 12 or 15 into what they call wolf packs to attack the convoy from every direction. The Americans are going to mimic some of those tactics in the Pacific, not so much the wolf pack thing, but going after the merchant ships. And by the end of the war, the U.S. Navy's submarines are going to have a devastating impact on the Japanese economy. They're going to sink most of the Japanese merchant marine alongside American aircraft, and this is going to have a profound impact on the way that World War II and the Pacific ends. So the fact that those submarines were not casualties of Pearl Harbor was very, very important. Most of the aircraft that were lost at Pearl Harbor were also out of date. They were old models that would have been of little utility in combat. And so we don't want to downplay the damage that was done. It was significant. It puts America on its back feet militarily in the Pacific, and it's going to take a while to recover from that. But the thing, of course, that Pearl Harbor really does is to galvanize the American people and to galvanize the American government. All the wishy-washiness about, neutrality and isolationism. Do we really want to get involved in Europe's problems? Do we really want to get involved in Asia's problems? All of that disappeared when people heard over their radios that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, and this was a surprise attack. There had been no declaration of war. The Japanese had, in fact, intended to deliver a message message to the American government, breaking off negotiations to maintain peace in the Pacific right before their plane struck at Pearl Harbor for a variety of complicated reasons. That message was not delivered until the attack was well underway. But even if it had been delivered, it wasn't a declaration of war. It was simply breaking off negotiations, and therefore the American people were even more outraged. This had been a sneak attack. It had been a sneak attack. And there were repercussions for that. The country was united. It was galvanized. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt was able to go before a joint session of Congress, and in one of his most memorable speeches, he talked about a day that will live in infamy, asked the Congress to declare war, which of course it very, very promptly did. And the interesting thing about this is that the United States might have only fought World War II in the Pacific, but Hitler decided to honor his alliance with the Axis powers, although technically he wasn't forced to. That was a defensive alliance. So if the United States had attacked Japan, that alliance triggered. But if Japan attacked the United States, well, it didn't necessarily, but basically Hitler, who saw the U.S. as already in the war, supporting England economically, that you might as well fight the Americans. And so on December 11th of 1941, Germany declares war on the United States. Italy follows suit. The United States declares war on Germany and Italy. And so now we're in the fight in both Europe and the Pacific. And this came as a great relief to Winston Churchill. As horrible as the news of Pearl Harbor was, he said he went back to bed that night and slept like a baby because he knew that the Allies had won the war. And the Allies by this point, of course, are not just England, but also the Soviet Union. Following the traditional logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, England had become an ally of Stalin and the Soviet Union, and now the United States is an ally of Stalin and the Soviet Union, and we will be sending Lend-Lease to the Russians as well as to the British and to the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Chinese and these sorts of things. So America is now in the war, and for the first 6 months of that war, things went very, very badly in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Atlantic, the German U-boats, which were having an increasingly rough time with Allied navies and Allied aircraft in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, which lasts almost the entire period between 1939 and 1945, is as much a technological and an intelligence war as anything else. The Germans were very good at cracking German codes, but the Germans would switch those codes, and so the British could, sort of get a feel for what the Germans were doing, and then they lost it. But this ability to crack German codes, codenamed Ultra, was one of the great secrets of World War II, and it really gave the Allies in the West an insight into German strategy that would prove to be very useful on a number of occasions. In fact, the secret was so delicate that it was not released to the public until the 1970s that we had been reading German codes and Japanese codes and this sort of thing. But the U-boats were able now to cross the Atlantic to attack the American coastline. Although the ships sailing along the coast were carefully blacked out, no blackout orders had been given to the cities on shore, and so their bright lights silhouetted the ships and made them easy targets for U-boats, not just along the Atlantic coast, but the Gulf Coast too. German U-boats were out there sinking ships off Corpus Christi and off Galveston. People could stand on the beach in Texas, and they could look out to sea, and they could see the great big columns of black smoke rising up into the air from burning oil tankers. And it would take a while for the Americans to form convoy systems and to better protect those merchant ships from the U-boats. In the Pacific, things were even worse. The Japanese managed to destroy most of MacArthur's Air Force on the ground. In January of 1942, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. The American and Filipinos were grossly overmatched here, and they withdrew to a peninsula of land near the city of Manila on the island of Luzon called Bataan. And there they're going to manage to hold out until early April of 1942 and hold off everything that the Japanese could throw at them. But eventually they're going to run out of food, medicine, and munitions, and they're going to be forced to surrender. MacArthur was not there for the surrender. He was very famous, and FDR did not want him to be captured, so he ordered him out of the Philippines. The general, along with his wife and his son, who was a little boy, did that in a very dramatic fashion on PT boats, a small wooden plywood, patrol craft, and they slipped through the Japanese blockade and got into Australia. What MacArthur thought he was doing was coming to Australia to take command of a massive force that was going to fight its way to the relief of the Philippines. And so when he got to Australia and he met the press, he made his famous pledge that I came through, meaning the blockade, and I shall return. And this became one of the great American battle cries of the Pacific War. MacArthur's promise of I shall return, of course, he said that before he realized that he wasn't going to be able to return anytime soon because the Pacific Fleet had been wrecked at Pearl Harbor, and the United States was going to need time to recover from that. So MacArthur is going to take command of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, which New Guinea, Australia, and that region that leads back up to the Philippines. I'll send you some maps. This is really hard to do without being able to point at maps. But the Central Pacific and the Northern Pacific are going to be under the command of Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz was from Fredericksburg, Texas, just down the road from Austin. That's why the National Museum of the Pacific War is there. It's certainly worth going to check out. Very impressive museum with a very impressive collection. And Nimitz is going to be one of the masterminds of America's victory in World War II. A very humble man, but a very competent military leader who gets command of the Pacific Fleet after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. And it's Nimitz who orders the immediate commencement of unrestricted submarine warfare against the Japanese. Nonetheless, in those first 6 months of the war, as the general in charge of the Japanese Navy, the admiral in charge of the Japanese Navy, Admiral Yamamoto, had predicted for the first 6 months he could run roughshod over the Allies, but after that it would be no sure thing. Remember that what the Japanese are hoping to do is to administer a body blow to the United States, from which it would take several years to recover, and by the time we recovered, the Japanese would be so firmly entrenched in all their conquered new territory that we would be unwilling to fight our way through that to retake everything and to punish the Japanese. In this regard, the Japanese were partly right and partly wrong. In those first 6 months, they overran the British colony of Hong Kong. They would force the surrender of American troops in the Philippines. This would be one of the great surrenders in American history. The fall of the Bataan Peninsula would see 76,000 Filipino and American prisoners march into Japanese prison camps in the Philippines. 5,200 Americans died on what was known as the Bataan Death March. So the Japanese Code of Bushido held that the surrender was the most disgraceful thing that a soldier could do, that once you surrendered, you were really no longer a human being. And the Japanese treatment of Allied POWs in their camps was absolutely horrific. Most people think of the Holocaust when they think of the great atrocities of World War II, and it is certainly the great atrocity of World War II. But the Japanese treatment of civilians and Allied prisoners of war was on par with what the Germans did in Europe. Prisoners were sent to work on the Railway of Death in Burma. They were starved, they were beaten, they were executed. There were examples of medical experimentation on captured Allied pilots by the Japanese. And so the men who were captured by the Japanese and the civilians who fell under their rule were going to suffer a very great deal for a very long time. In addition to the loss of Hong Kong and the Philippines, the Japanese overran the Dutch East Indies. They overran Burma. They took Guam, and they took Wake, although the Marines defending Wake Island managed to beat back the first attempt by the Japanese to land there. It led to a morale-raising moment for the American people at a very dark time in the war, when there was a radio message that came from Wake in response to a request of what the garrison defending Wake needed, and they had said, send more Japs, Japs being a phrase that was commonly used to refer to the Japanese during World War II. That gallant defense, however, was doomed to defeat. The garrison at Wake was overwhelmed and forced to surrender. So that by the time that you get to late May of 1941, the Japanese have taken just about everything that they wanted in the Pacific, including the great British naval base of Singapore. There was a great shock that it fell. Its defenses had been built to defend against a naval attack, and the Japanese instead came down the Malaysian peninsula to attack it by land. As part of that campaign, they sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse. You know, this was an instance of aircraft sinking battleships. That was a great shock to a lot of people at that time of the war. And so for the first 6 months of the war, nothing but bad news. And of course, there was a panic on the West Coast. People after Pearl Harbor dreaded, feared, believed that the Japanese might actually invade the United States, that they might attack the Panama Canal. Of course, none of those things ever happened. The Panama Canal was never threatened. The Japanese did, use their submarines to throw some shells into American territory, and a float plane or two dropped a bomb or two. But the Japanese did not have the wherewithal to even invade Hawaii. It was too far away, and sustaining a supply line to feed and equip a garrison there was beyond the logistical capability of the Japanese, but nobody knew that. And part of the panic on the West Coast led to Americans being angry and highly suspicious of the very large population of Japanese Americans who lived in California, Oregon, and Washington states. There had always been a good amount of racial prejudice against these Orientals, as they were called. Remember that in the 1920s, the new immigration laws had actually banned all immigrants from Asia. And although a significant number of these Japanese Americans were first generation, meaning that they had actually migrated, many of these were second or third generations. They were born and raised Americans, but of course they looked Japanese. And in the paranoia of the time, these people had their loyalty suspected. This is one of the great tragedies in American history, but it's one of the things that happens in wartime. It is one of the horrible things that happens in wartime, is that logic and reason very often go out the window when people are angry and they're afraid. And so FDR issued an order forcing Japanese Americans of Japanese ancestry to be forcibly relocated into internment camps in the interior of the United States. And so in Texas and Oklahoma and on the plains and this sort of stuff, the Japanese Americans voluntarily cooperated with that. There were, in fact, no traitors, no spies amongst them. They were incredibly loyal. A lot of their young men would volunteer or agree to be drafted into the American military, where they would earn a very commendable record in combat in the European theater. But at the time, this was considered something that had to be done, and a lot of these Japanese Americans lost their homes, their farms, their property, and it was a very tragic thing. As the war went on, more of them would be released, but the damage, of course, done to them could not be completely repaired. But this is how grim things got for America in those first 6 months of the war. Things, however, from a historical perspective, turned around pretty quickly. The Japanese were beginning to overextend themselves. They were getting overconfident, and the Americans and the Allies were beginning to fight back with more effectiveness. Remember those 1930s era Navy acts that had begun to build battleships and aircraft carriers and stuff. Well, that had been just enough lead time for some of those ships to begin to come into the fleet in 1942, and this is going to prove to be remarkably helpful. The Americans are going to blunt the Japanese at the Battle of Coral Sea in early May of 1942. This was an attempt by the Japanese to sever the supply lines between the U.S. and Australia. And so the Battle of Coral Sea, which was fought purely by aircraft flown by aircraft carriers, the first time that had ever happened in history, saw the Japanese damage one American carrier, sink another. We sank one small Japanese carrier, damaged a big one, and shot the air group of a third one all to pieces. And this turns out to be important because that means those Japanese carriers will not be available in early June when the Japanese make a major effort to capture Midway, which, remember, is about 1,200 miles to the northwest of Hawaii. American codebreakers discovered what the Japanese plan was. There had to be a lot of guesswork there. It wasn't like we were just reading their messages, and not everybody agreed on the interpretation of those messages. Admiral Nimitz, however, came to believe his codebreakers that Midway was the target, and so he sent the 3 American aircraft carriers that were available in the Pacific to blunt the Japanese drive. And in the early days of June 4th, 5th, and 6th, 1942, there was a great naval battle around the island of Midway, and a very dramatic one in which the United States sank all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers that were at Midway, losing only 1 aircraft carrier of our own, the USS Yorktown. And in addition to the loss of those carriers, the Japanese lost a lot of specialist mechanics and engineers and that kind of thing that they had spent years training to make their aircraft carrier fleet as dangerous and as capable as it was. And the Japanese are never really going to recover from that. So Midway stalls the Japanese in the Pacific. It throws them over more or less onto the defensive. Now, not entirely, because the Japanese then turn south. They occupy an island called Guadalcanal. And remember, I'm going to send you a list of terms so you can figure out how to spell some of these things. But the Japanese built an airfield on Guadalcanal, and from that airfield they could threaten, they could attack the Allied supply line between the U.S. and Australia. So on August 1st of 1942, the United States launched its first offensive campaign of World War II by sending the 1st Marine Division and an American fleet to retake Guadalcanal. The Marines landed with very little opposition, and this began a 6-month-long series of battles for control of Guadalcanal. And arguably, if Coral Sea and Midway stopped Japanese expansion, it is the battles around Guadalcanal, both on land, in the air, and at sea, that are really going to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. It's going to see Japanese air power decimated. It's going to see every attempt of the Japanese to overrun and destroy the Americans on Guadalcanal who are defending the airfield there called Henderson Field, thrown back in very, very brutal and bloody combat. And the naval battles are going to be even worse. The Americans at one point are going to be down to a single carrier in the Pacific thanks to the battles around Guadalcanal. In the beginning, we're going to get the worst end of it because because at the start of World War II, Japanese aircraft were better. Japanese naval tactics, especially destroyer tactics and night fighting tactics, were superior to those of the United States. The Japanese had far better torpedoes, which they could launch from their cruisers and their destroyers as well as their submarines. The American torpedoes at the beginning of the war are horrible and defective and very often don't explode. But in 6 months of combat, a lot of those problems are going to be rectified, and the United States is going to manage to hold on to Guadalcanal. And Admiral Nimitz, with his subordinate commanders, Admiral Spruance and Admiral Halsey, are able to, win a very significant victory there that puts the United States in a position to go over to the offensive. So our first offensive action in World War II is in the Pacific at Guadalcanal. Of course, in the European theater, our Navy is involved in the Battle of the Atlantic from the get-go, but we don't get involved in the land fighting until November of 1942, when we send an army across the entire Atlantic Ocean to invade French North Africa. France had been conquered by the Germans, but the southern part of France had been allowed to retain a certain amount of independence, as sort of a client state of the Germany. It was known as Vichy France, and this had put the French army and French generals in the colonies of North Africa into a kind of a quandary. If they did anything to anger the Germans, Germany might overrun and occupy the rest of France. They felt honor bound to obey the edicts of the Vichy government. But the American landing in North Africa is important because in October of 1942, a new British commander, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, had finally won a decisive victory over Field Marshal Rommel and the Afrika Korps in Egypt at a battle called El Alamein. And this battle had forced the Germans to retreat across Libya back toward Tunisia. And what the Americans are doing by invading North Africa, and the British are coming in to North Africa from the west as well, is to try and squeeze Rommel between two forces. This American invasion was led initially by General who's going to become very famous in the war. General George S. Patton is one of the more colorful personalities, one of the more hard-driving of the American generals. And the Americans put the squeeze on the Afrika Korps, but the Afrika Korps manages to get back to Tunisia and to make a stand. It turns and it strikes against the Americans, who suffer a serious defeat in February of 1942 at the Battle February 1943, at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where the Germans really administer a licking to us. The American experience in Tunisia, in North Africa, is going to be a learning ground for the American Army. We're going to have to come up with better tanks and better tactics. Our doctrine had not necessarily been up to fighting the Germans, but the Americans are going to learn in World War II like they learned in World War I very quickly. That learning curve is going to be very, very steep. And in 1942 is where the war kind of comes into something of a stalemate. The Germans have launched a new offensive in Russia and have gotten themselves embroiled in a horrific fight for the city of Stalingrad, and that is going to go on into 1943, and it is here in 1943 where the tide really begins to turn. In 1943, an entire German army is going to be surrounded and starved into surrender at Stalingrad between the American army that has formed in North Africa under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, another Texan by birth, and General Montgomery. They are going to, by May of 1943, destroy the German army in North Africa. Rommel's going to escape. He's sick, and Hitler pulls him out. But more than 250,000 German and Italian prisoners are going to be taken in Tunisia in May of 1943. That's not long after as an enormous German army is forced to surrender at Stalingrad. In the Atlantic, the Allies are gaining the advantage in the battle against the U-boats, and in the Pacific, MacArthur has begun to fight his way up the coast of New Guinea toward the Philippines, and Nimitz has begun to launch a campaign in the Central Pacific. It is going to see its first real test in a brutal battle in November of 1943 at a place called Tarawa Atoll, one of the most vicious battles fought in the Pacific during World War II, but a battle in which the Americans prevail. MacArthur and Nimitz are running parallel campaigns. MacArthur is advancing through the Southwest Pacific toward the Philippines. Nimitz is advancing through the Central Pacific toward Japan itself, and both of them are practicing a strategy called island hopping. And basically what that means is the Japanese had fortified a lot of islands in the Pacific. They put airfields on them and big garrisons, and they expected the Americans to have to attack and take these islands, some of which were defended by hundreds of thousands of men. And what MacArthur and Nimitz do is to avoid most of those concentrations of Japanese strength. They use American submarines and American aircraft carriers and American ground-based bombers to destroy the airfields on these island bases, and that deprives them of any offensive capability whatsoever. Then they're surrounded and left to wither on the vine, to basically starve to death under occasional bombardment by sea and air, and you're going to leap around those to attack more lightly defended targets. Now, you couldn't avoid every concentration of Japanese strength. There are going to be some pretty brutal battles in this business at places like Kwajalein and Saipan and Tinian in the Central Pacific. The Japanese Navy is going to sortie to try and stop this American island hopping campaign. It's going to lead to several very large naval battles, like the Battle for the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American aircraft so dominated the skies that and so easily shot down attacking Japanese planes that our pilots said it was like shooting turkeys. The United States is going to island hop its way ever closer to Japan throughout the end of 1943 and all through 1944 as American submarines do more and more damage to the Japanese home front. By the time that we take the islands in the Central Pacific, Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, that kind of thing, we have brought ourselves within strategic bomber range of the Japanese mainland. And so here's another thing that's going on in World War II in both Europe and the Pacific. We are launching, along with the British, a strategic bombing campaign. In the interwar period, when air power was really coming into its own, there had been a great debate over the role of aircraft in future wars, and the advocates of bombers had said that, hey, we can avoid all this bitter fighting on the ground, and the bombers can go over the front lines and they can pummel enemy industry and destroy the enemy's ability to make wars. This harkens back to the days of Ulysses S. Grant and Sherman and how they defeated the Confederacy. We might not be able to destroy its armies, but we can destroy their ability to fight. We can destroy the Confederacy's way to make war. The same thing in the Indian campaigns, or wipe out the buffalo, destroy the Indians' ability, if they're not willingness to make war. And so in both Europe and the Pacific, there was a strategic bombing campaign, and this was one of the hardest fought campaigns of World War II. It was very bloody business, especially early on. Again, we don't have time to talk about it in any kind of detail. The strategic bombing campaign in Europe is going to see very large American and British casualties. The Americans will be bombing Germany by day, the British by night. The British believed in what was called area bombardment. The aircraft were not capable of dropping their bombs with great accuracy in World War II, or by today's standards with any accuracy at all. Americans remained dedicated, however, to trying to hit their targets, to hit the railroad yards, the oil refineries, the factories, the bridges and stuff. The British, simply, bombing at night, just said, we're going to bomb an entire city, and we'll do so much devastation that this will disrupt the German economy. This is going to have a huge effect on Germany, although the Germans, interesting enough, did not fully mobilize their economy until 1943. So even despite strategic bombing, Germany will be cranking out more fighters, more tanks, more artillery pieces than it had before. But if there hadn't been a strategic bombing campaign, they would have been able to do even better than they did. And the one place, of course, where the Germans could not really make up for what was being done to them was in the destruction of their oil refineries, which the Germans did not have a lot of capacity there. It's going to be worse in the Pacific, where the Americans, flying a brand new bomber called the B-29, which had been designed, developed, tested, and put into production in just about 10 months, and had the enormously long range necessary to fly from the Marianas to Japan, found Japanese cities particularly vulnerable to incendiary attack. That is, you drop bombs that were designed to start fires, and Japanese cities were basically made of wood, and so they burned very quickly. And these strategic bombing campaigns were really devastating to the Axis powers. They killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians, but they were a mortal blow to the Axis ability to produce the material of war. And here is another place where the United States is going to play a really critical role. There is a saying that World War II was won with British brains, referencing the code breaking, Russian blood, representing the titanic struggle between the Russian and the German armies on the Western Front, and American industry. Over the course of World War II, the United States is going to put 16.3 million men and women into uniform. That's 1/6 of the entire male population of the United States. But we're going to do more than just put people in uniform. We're going to put people in factories. 73 million people out of a population of 135 million are going to work in industry. They're going to build the ships, the planes, the tanks, make the ammunition, the rifles, the medicines, the uniforms, and these sorts of things. And it's not just, of course, men. Enormous numbers of women and minorities go into these factories. And this is going to fundamentally change America in the post-war era, because women had gone into the workforce for the first time. Really, in these kind of numbers, they had played a vital role in helping to win the war. And many of these women are not going to be happy to go back and simply be housewives when the war is over. But America's productive capacity was really mind-boggling. Over the course of the war, the United States is going to produce 37,000, over the course of the war, the United States is going to produce 86,000 tanks, 120,000 artillery pieces, 1,200 warships, 82,000 landing craft, 2,600 merchant ships called Liberty or Victory ships, over 700 oil tankers. We're going to make 96,000 bombers, 88,000 fighter planes, 23,000 transport planes. We're going to make more than 14 million shoulder-fired weapons, rifles, carbines, pistols, bazookas, these sorts of things, and more than 2.4 million trucks. In fact, by the time that World War II is coming to an end, you could have taken every service member in the United States Army and most of the civilian employees and put them into a vehicle all at the same time and driven them someplace. If you contrast this to what the Axis forces were able to do, it's really kind of mind-boggling. If you just look at Allied aircraft, American aircraft production, 303,695 aircraft of all types, All of the Axis forces together, Germany, Italy, Japan, Bulgaria, Romania, the rest of them, produced only 196,000 aircraft. In terms of tanks, the United States, as I said, makes more than 60,000. The Axis powers just make barely 27,000. And this can be seen all throughout everything, and especially if you add all the rest of the allies. We add the British and the Russians and the Australians and the New Zealanders together, then you're talking about 570,000 aircraft produced for the allies versus 196,000 for the Axis powers, 139,000 tanks versus 27,000 tanks, that's worldwide. If you look at just the Pacific, the United States, in terms of its industrial capacity, far outstretched the Japanese, not just because we were self-sufficient in oil, food, we had all the iron ore and the raw materials necessary to do all this. We had the workforce to do it. The United States, over the course of World War II, builds 141 aircraft carriers of all sizes. The Japanese build 17. We build 10 battleships. The Japanese build 2. We build 48 cruisers. The Japanese build 9. We build 349 destroyers. The Japanese build 63. We build 203 submarines compared to their 167. And with that kind of material advantage was huge on the battlefield. We really did become what FDR wanted us to be, the arsenal of democracy. And by 1944, on all battlefronts, the Allies were on the offensive. The Russians launched a massive offensive that would throw the Germans completely out of Russia and drive them back into Poland. The Americans had, along with the British, invaded Italy in September of 1943 and fought their way up the boot of Italy in some of the most horrible, difficult fighting that Allied soldiers would see during the war. This is where the 36th Division of the Texas National Guard sees its first year of combat. Eventually, though, this leads to the capture of Rome on June 4th of 1944, and 2 days later, the Allies launch a massive invasion, the largest invasion, amphibious invasion in history, across the English Channel into Normandy. And this is the famous D-Day operation. By that time, Dwight Eisenhower had become the supreme commander of all Allied forces in the European theater. He had as his lieutenants Field Marshal Montgomery and Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. And these massive armies, supported by enormous navies and air forces, managed to fight their way ashore in Normandy. There was a brutal battle for the beachhead that would last for nearly 6 weeks, but eventually the Allies would break out and they would begin the race across France, with the Germans in rapid retreat, Patton's Third Army being the spearhead. In mid-August of 1944, we launched another invasion of France, the invasion of southern France along the Mediterranean coast. The 36th Infantry Division of the Texas Guard was part of that as well, and they would link up with the Allied armies and begin to push toward the German border. In the Pacific, MacArthur is going to return to the Philippines in October of 1944, and he's going to spend the rest of the war clearing the Philippines in incredibly brutal combat. In the China-Burma-India theater, the Japanese conquest of Burma begins to be reversed. The British have repelled an invasion of the Japanese trying to get into India, and now with American logistical support and some ground support, they're beginning to fight their way back into Burma. American strategic bombers and submarines are isolating Japan, rendering Japan less and less capable of continuing the war. The Japanese Navy is pretty much going to the bottom of the ocean by the beginning of 1945. And those final battles in the Philippines are the final great naval battles there. The Japanese are going to be beaten very badly. The U-boat threat has been largely eliminated by this point. And it's very clear to everybody that the Axis powers are going to lose, but they're going to, fight to the bitter end. In December of 1944, Hitler makes a last-ditch gamble to try and separate the British and the Americans from one another and force the Allied armies under Eisenhower to retreat back toward Normandy. And he launches a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. This is the same area that the Germans had launched their 1940 offensive that had led to the British evacuation at Dunkirk and the fall of France just a few short weeks later. And although the Germans did manage to strike by surprise in bad weather that grounded Allied air forces and drive a deep bulge into the American lines, the Americans managed to stop them. There was a gallant defense of a critical crossroads at a place called Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Division were cut off and surrounded but refused to surrender. The American armies on either end of the bulge kept it from expanding and then launched a counterattack that within a month's time had flattened the bulge. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be called, one of the larger American actions in World War II, 100,000 American casualties over the course of that. But this was a decisive defeat for the Germans, and basically it used up the last reserves of the German army, and therefore the end in Europe is going to come very quickly once you get into spring. In early March of 1945, American troops are going to capture a bridge over the Rhine River at a place called Remagen. The Americans are going to get over the river in a couple places. The British then are going to launch a massive attack that involves an airborne operation in support of it to get over the Rhine. The Russians, of course, are coming in from the east. And they are going to attack and take Berlin. Eisenhower decides not to send British and American troops to Berlin because he knows that we've already agreed on how we're going to divide Germany into spheres of occupation. We're going to get a slice of Berlin, as are the British and the French, the Russians. Why fight and bleed in a big battle for the German capital, which is not really necessary. Let the Russians do it. Hitler commits suicide. Germany is almost completely overrun, and of course in the overrunning of Germany and Eastern Europe, the horrors of the concentration camps are uncovered. The reality that the Germans have been systematically and with almost scientific precision been attempting to eliminate entire peoples. 6 million Jews had been killed or in gas chambers, or simply shot or worked to death or starved to death in the Holocaust. Some of them had been the subjects of incredibly cruel medical experimentation, but not just Jews, but gypsies, homosexuals, people with physical or mental handicaps, all had been sent into the concentration camps. Some 10 million people in total had become victims of Nazi barbarity, and this was a horrible shock, a horrible thing to discover, and it really highlighted the fact that this had been, as Eisenhower called it, a great crusade against the greatest evil that mankind had ever known. And on May 8th of 1945, what was left of the German military surrendered, and the war in Europe came to an end. The war in the Pacific is going to last for a while longer, and it's going to see some of the bitterest fighting yet to come. In February of 1945, the U.S. Marine Corps, under Nimitz's direction, attacked an island about 600 miles from Japan called Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was only 5 square miles in size. It was defended by a Japanese army of about 23,000 men. They were attacked by 50,000 Americans who had complete air and naval superiority, but the Japanese had by this point switched tactics. Instead of launching what were really futile but very brave banzai charges to try and expel Americans from an island, instead of trying to stop the Americans from landing, the Japanese had decided to make each island so expensive in terms of blood to capture that the Americans would shy away from an attempted invasion of Japan. The battle for Iwo Jima was incredibly violent, incredibly vicious and brutal. And it went on for 5 weeks. And at the end of those 5 weeks, almost the entire Japanese garrison had fought to the death. Japanese troops very seldom surrendered. There were only 200 prisoners taken on Iwo Jima. So most of the 23,000 American garrison had died, but they had inflicted 25,000 American casualties. Just as the battle for Iwo Jima was coming to an end, the Americans invaded another island, this one much larger, called Okinawa, which was only 400 miles from Japan. And it was defended by a Japanese army of 100,000 men. The battle for Okinawa took something like 3 months. And during those 3 months, the Japanese launched a new tactic, or really brought to the fore a new tactic that had first seen its presence in the Philippine battles, and that was the use of the kamikaze. Japanese pilots who had very little training, were very young, were put in planes that had enough fuel for a one-way trip. Those planes had bombs strapped to them, and their mission was to deliberately dive bomb, to crash into American warships. So this was the suicide attacks is what these were. Some 10,000 kamikaze strikes were launched against the American fleet off of Okinawa. They would sink or damage some 300 American ships, kill or wound many thousands of American sailors. Most of the kamikazes would be shot down, but enough would get through to do incredible damage. And so by the time the Battle of Okinawa was over, this Japanese tactic had really shown how much the Japanese were willing to do to try and defend their homeland. 97,000 of the Japanese defenders on Okinawa were killed before the battle was over. There were nearly 50,000 American casualties. By that point, however, MacArthur had pretty much recaptured the Philippines, although there was still fighting going on there. The British were well on their way to reconquering Burma. The Japanese had been stalled in Asia. The Soviet Union had agreed to come into the war on our side against the Japanese within a month of the surrender of Hitler, or the surrender of Germany. Hitler, of course, was dead. The American submarine force and the American Navy had basically isolated Japan. Its merchant marine was at the bottom of the ocean. Its Navy was at the bottom of the ocean. A good chunk of the overwhelming majority of the Japanese Air Force had been shot out of the sky. The Japanese were on the verge of starvation. In a lot of places, their industry had, ground to a halt. The next obvious step was an invasion of Japan. But the Japanese had shown no inclination to surrender. In fact, the Pacific War had gotten harder, more brutal and bloodier with every step closer we had taken toward Japan. And so there was a lot of dread about what was going to come if there had to be an invasion of the 4 Japanese home islands. There aren't that many good landing beaches in Japan. It was pretty easy for the Japanese to guess where we were going to come ashore. They had prepared appropriately 14-mile deep defensive sectors. The Japanese still had 5,000 kamikaze aircraft hidden away and waiting for us, 5,000 kamikaze speedboats and midget submarines waiting for us. The Japanese still had 2 million men under arms. They were teaching women and children to fight with swords and bamboo spears, or to strap explosives to themselves and become suicide attackers on their own. And the best prognosis was that if we had to invade and overrun all 4 of the Japanese home islands, and the Japanese resisted here the way that they had resisted on Okinawa and Iwo Jima and in the Philippines and places like Tarawa and Saipan, the war was going to go on for another 1 to 2 years. We would probably lose somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million Americans killed or wounded, and have to inflict something on the order of 3 to 5 million Japanese casualties. And the question was, were we going to have to go through that? And that was a question that a new American president was going to have to answer. In November of 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been reelected to an unprecedented fourth term. This was a measure of confidence that the country had in him for his leadership during the Great Depression and World War II. But FDR's health was abysmal at this point. It was very obvious that he was very, very ill. He had withered away. He looked cadaverous. And in April of 1944, he had died suddenly at his presidential resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. This was a great shock to the country, and it made Harry S. Truman, senator from Missouri, the vice president, the commander-in-chief. Truman was a veteran of World War I. He had been an artillery officer. He has some experience with the horrors of war, and he was the guy who was going to have to give the order to invade Japan. But as it turns out, he was not going to have to give that order because very early on, even before we got involved in World War I, FDR had started, at the behest of people like Albert Einstein, a secret program called the Manhattan Project. And the goal of the Manhattan Project was to build an atomic bomb. This is something that the Germans were working on. Even the Japanese were making some strides to it, and Einstein had warned that if the Germans got there first, they would be able to conquer the world. So we started a super secret program that spent $2 billion, employed 100,000 people across the country in absolute secrecy, and with the brain power of a lot of people, including many famous scientists who had fled Hitler's Europe. We managed to win the race and become the first country in history to explode an atomic bomb at a test site in the New Mexico desert on July 18th of 1945. Within a couple of months, we had 2 deliverable bombs that could be used against the Japanese. And for Truman, this was a very easy question to answer. By using these bombs, we could bring the war hopefully to a quick close. It would save hundreds of thousands, and it would save millions of Japanese lives. It would demonstrate to the world the horror, the power of these new weapons, send a signal for the post-war era that might mean it would be far less bloody than the pre-war the period had been with 2 world wars. And so Truman gave the order. And on August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped one of these bombs on the city of Hiroshima. And in the blink of an eye, that city ceased to exist. And something like 60,000 Japanese died or would die soon after. 2 days later, on August 8th, the Soviet Union, keeping its promise, declared war on Japan. The next day, on August 9th, it attacked the Japanese armies in Manchuria, began to overrun them easily, and even then the Japanese refused to quit. The Japanese looked at the atomic bomb and said, well, this is really no worse than what the American B-29s have been doing. In March of 1945, 300 American B-29s had raided the city of Tokyo. They bombed it for several hours. When they left, 100,000 Japanese had been killed, 1 million people had been rendered homeless, and 16 square miles of Tokyo had been burned out. And the Japanese said, well, if you're not going to surrender in the face of that, why surrender in the face of the atomic bomb? It's just more efficient. 1 plane, 1 bomb to do what 300 planes and thousands of bombs had been required to do a few months earlier. And so the Japanese were determined to keep fighting. And therefore, on August 9th of 1945, another B-29, this one called Boxcar, dropped a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. And once more, in the blink of an eye, a city was obliterated and 35,000 people died. It was at that point that the Japanese Emperor Hirohito said that is enough. And he ordered the Japanese people to capitulate. And on August 14th of 45, the Japanese announced that they would give up. On September 2nd of 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese signed the instruments of their surrender, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz signing on behalf of the United States. And World War II, the bloodiest war in human history, had come to an end. It had conservatively killed 20 million people. Far more people died in World War II than had died in World War I. It had truly been a global conflict, and it left most of Asia, a good part of the Soviet Union, and most of Europe and the Middle East in absolute ruin. The Allies had been victorious, the Axis powers had been destroyed. The true extent of their evil, as evidenced by their concentration camps and their prisoner of war camps, became truly evident only as the fighting came to an end. But the great conflict was over, and now the question was, how does the world move forward? What changes have been unleashed by this war? Are they going to be as negative and as dangerous as the changes that had been unleashed by the First World War? And that remained to be seen. So that brings us to an end of chapter 26 in our discussion, again, a very broad and fast-paced discussion of World War II and how it was fought. So here are your 5 questions for this lecture. Question number 1, what is the name of the U.S. strategy in the Pacific that MacArthur and Nimitz used to advance across the Pacific? What was the name given to that? Question number 2, what was the code name for the Allied invasion of France in 1944? What was the code name of the Allied invasion of France? Very famous name, a date well remembered. Number 3, what was the name of the naval battle that brought an end to Japanese expansion in the Pacific in June of 1942? What was the name of the naval battle fought between aircraft carriers that brought an end to Japanese expansion in the Pacific in June of 1942? Question number 4, who was the commander-in-chief of the United States Pacific Fleet during World War II? A fellow from Fredericksburg, Texas. What was the name of the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in World War II? And then finally, question number 5, what was the name of the supreme commander of Allied forces in the European theater during World War II? What was the name of the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II? So those are those 5 questions that brings us to an end of the 1940s, and we will pick up the story when we get together next time and see what the post-war world is going to be like.